So who wins and who loses from 40k's latest balance update, and how much will it change things? Let's talk through the update and the armies that gained and lost the most. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today, now the dust has settled on the 40k balance data slate, I thought we'd talk through each faction affected and who have come out of the changes best and worst. As I'm sure most people who are watching are well aware, 40k had a balanced data slate last week. It came out on Thursday and made a whole bunch of tweaks to the game. Games Workshop's usual attempt is to try and rebalance the strongest factions by making them a bit weaker and give a boost to some of the weakest factions in one way or another. I'd argue that most of these changes were kind of small ones, to be honest. Maybe it makes sense, what with 10th edition on the horizon, rather than trying to truly shake up the game with massive headline-grabbing updates, and points weren't affected, seeing as this was a mid-season one, which perhaps limited the scope of some simple changes they would have liked to make. In this video I thought we'd talk winners and losers, and for this one I'm going to rate losers as either having a negative rules impact that made them weaker, or were weak already and Games Workshop hasn't really helped them out. For winners from the data slate, I'm either going to talk about armies that had a rules boost to make them slightly stronger in one way or another, or kind of won by omission, being at or around Games Workshop's 55% win percentage, but not having anything done to tone them down. Let's talk through each faction in turn, starting out with the biggest losers. So first up, I'd say perhaps the armies that had the worst time of it out of the data slate were maybe the Dark Angels and Imperial Fists. Dark Angels being a powerful army that perhaps got the single biggest nerf out of the whole update, and Imperial Fists by omission. If counting their standalone codex individually, they've basically been one of the weakest factions throughout all of 9th edition, and actually got slightly worse in this update as well due to the changes with codex warfare. Starting out with the Dark Angels, I'd say that theirs is the only update that really just does destroy one style of playing an army. They were doing absolutely great before, admittedly, with a 58% win percentage, about as good as it gets in current 40k, carried fairly equally by a combination of enormously tough Deathwing and crazy fast moving Raven Wing with heavy weapons buffs, maybe adding a few Desolation squads here and there. Games Workshop hit them with two main nerfs, the main one being to Inner Circle. This just made Deathwing from abnormally strong Terminators into a unit that's much more in line with just about every Space Marine faction's Terminators. They went from having transhuman physiology, which was excellent on Terminators, Inner Circle only allowed them to be wounded on a 4+, to basically just entirely losing that rule for nothing in its place. Only wounded on a 4+ is excellent for toughness 4 Terminators. They're exactly the sort of infantry unit that it's still very efficient to fire anti-tank weapons at, and this just generally made them a pain to take down. I feel like just flat out removing it was maybe a little bit on the harsh side. I feel like if they maybe toned it down to mini transhuman, only wounded on a 3+ or better, that might have kept the spirit with the rule while vastly reducing its power, but it seems that Games Workshop just wholesale removed it. It was kind of a tricky rule to balance, as it meant that whenever Terminators got kind of good for most Space Marines, the ones for Dark Angels just got amazing. One of the difficulties of balancing sub-factions there, and now arguably the Inner Circle rule itself is kind of unhelpful, as it still has that chance to prevent fallback because they're all martial pride and not wanting to back down from even the greatest foes. I'd still say it's not all doom and gloom for the Deathwing, they do still have some powerful abilities. Thunderhammer and Stormshield Terminators are just efficient in their own right, full stop, and the Dark Angels can have a bunch of nice things with them, like the -1 damage banner, their chapter tactic to give them +1 to hit in the enemy turn, and a really good unique data sheet which will allow them to pile on an extra Cyclone missile launcher into the Thunderhammer squad, plus a free Deny the Witch for a Watcher in the Dark. Some of their support characters are really nice as well, like the 4 rerolls to hit and wound that they can get from one of their Interromancy powers. My guess is that Dark Angels will still make use of them a bit, maybe just one supported unit though, rather than having entire squadrons of them. But it's definitely not good news if you were building an army around that Deathwing rule. I guess maybe Blade Guard might get a bit more of a look in as well, as they still have transhuman physiology now. It might give them a bit more of a selling point compared with Deathwing. Otherwise, there was that nerf to Codex Warfare, maximum of 5 victory points per doctrine. This will tone down the Raven Wing side of things a little bit. They often could rack up the score with that pretty quickly with a whole bunch of heavy weapons chewing through enemy units, so I guess that's another nerf there. Overall, I would certainly rate them as one of the bigger losers out of the entire data slate, but I think there's still enough strength in their codex to have them compete decently. I feel like lists are going to be far more slanted towards being Raven Wing heavy now though. Attack bikes, land speeders and storm speeders, maybe some Desolation Marines in support, perhaps one big unit of Deathwing. Otherwise, for the armies that lost the most, I'd say the other main one is the Imperial Fists. Their win rate has been pretty abysmal for a good long time, around about 28% at the moment. Games Workshop does seem to treat Imperial Fists a bit more of a sub-faction that they don't really bother to balance compared with the bigger Space Marine chapters, ones with more unique stuff like Blood Angels or Dark Angels. In 9th edition, Iron Hands just generally do what Imperial Fists want to do, but better. They'd have a bit more of a niche if Bolters were super strong damage dealers for Space Marines, but currently they kind of aren't. They were already really weak, and now they've arguably got weaker due to Codex Warfare with the Devastator Doctrine being nerfed. At least that was one reliable way to score a whole bunch of points, as they typically want to stay in Devastator Doctrine for a bunch of the game. Basically it looks like they're just going to be equally weak, if not weaker. Not great news with a mini-faction that's basically had the worst stats throughout most of 9th edition 40k. Moving on, here are the armies that I'd rate as minor losers out of the update. A trio of strong armies that got some small nerfs: Astra Militarum, Genestealer Cult and Iron Hands. All definitely tones down in power a bit, but I'd say not quite as much as the Dark Angels. Weaker armies that just didn't really get any significant help in my opinion: Thousand Suns, Chaos Space Marines or Adeptus Mechanicus, and perhaps the Tactical Doctrine Space Marine chapters, things like Ultramarines, Raven Guard and Salamanders. They'll still be affected by Codex Warfare, and certainly Ultramarines and Raven Guard weren't doing well already. First up, the Astra Militarum have been kind of upper mid-tier, around about a 52% win rate, but not doing too terribly on the top tables of events. They were nerfed in two main ways, with the Kazakin Overcharged Las Cells and the Finial of the Nemradesh First. The Kazakin one, I think, was maybe a nerf that a lot of people saw coming, changing their crazy mortal wound combo so it could deal no more than 6 mortal wounds in total, rather than potentially getting something like 15 to 18 wounds on average out of Lord Solar rerolls, plus the combination of Overcharged Las Cells and the Born Soldier's unique stratagem. Previously it was kind of de-restricted, as if you just split fire between a bunch of different units, you could do up to 6 mortal wounds to all of them, which provided you had multiple units to shoot at wasn't really a problem. You then couldn't really escape it either, as they could teleport around with the Barbican's Key, so unless you had Ignore's line of sight firepower or some extreme fast movers, it was a combo that against a lot of armies would just do crazy amounts of damage with not much counterplay. I'm not sure Guard, as their power level overall, really needed the combo turning down. Even with it, it doesn't seem like they're one of the top winning factions in 40k, but it maybe did oppress other choices within the Codex just a bit, and Kazakin will remain good without it. The other major nerf was to the Finial of the Nemradesh First standard. This has basically been an auto-include in Cadian command squads to give an aura of core units ignoring modifiers, feel no pain, damage caps, and -1 damage modifiers. Really quite a massive stack of things to ignore there, and it was toned down by no longer ignoring modifiers. I feel like it's going to remain a pretty decent relic even without that. Ignoring things like Feel No Pain or Abaddon or Catan damage caps is quite big for the Guard. Particularly if you're playing an army without a whole load of counter-charge melee, it could be hard to deal with units that can't take multi-phase damage. I still think it'll probably be taken, but maybe a bit less auto-include than it was before. I guess having it a bit weaker is a nerf to core firepower overall. Things like dense cover will be more problematic, and you wouldn't be able to ignore the penalty for moving and shooting heavy weapons or advancing and shooting assault weapons. Overall, I'd say these nerfs for the Guard will genuinely affect army power, but maybe not by crazy amounts. I expect to see their win rates drop to a bit more around about the 50% mark perhaps. They have toned down a few of the most powerful things that were included in almost every list. It is kind of interesting, seeing as they were previously strong but maybe not top tier, and some stronger armies didn't get touched. I'd say both Kazakin and the Finial are still playable, just maybe a little bit less excessive. You're maybe not going to have to invest as much into Kazakin to get that entire combo going, though they still certainly would like the Barbican's Key and Lord Solar rerolls if available. I think that the outcome might be that lists tend to focus a bit more on Lehman Russ spam. It just seems in general that core firepower options took a bit of a hit there, and as Russes were basically unaffected by these, they'll seem a little bit better by comparison. Next up, and I'd also rate the Genestealer Cults as minor losers, one of the very strong armies of 40k right now, again with a 58% win percent, but still with a reputation for being a bit harder to play than most, lots of units that aren't enormously durable and need to make great use of their gamey tricks. Genestealer Cults often tended to win just by sheer outscoring the opponent, rather than necessarily always winning the damage game. They could score primaries okay with a whole bunch of acolytes and neophytes, and they were lucky enough to have two of the best secondaries in just about all of Warhammer 40k between their ambush and brood swarm ones, very reliable ones to score high if you build around them. I think Games Workshop made a sensible change here and just made one of those a lot more mediocre. Brood Swarm used to be very easy to score for the Genestealer Cults, just literally outnumbering their foe, and then also trying to do so in your own deployment and in the midfield as well. and you could score up to 5 victory points in a single turn by also outnumbering the foe in their own deployment zone for a turn and doing all of those objectives at once. This one was toned down quite a bit so that you can only score 3 victory points per turn now, just the area positional ones and not the bonus one. Overall, it will still be very easy to score a good amount from this, but maxing it will be near impossible. I feel like now it's going to compete a lot better with things like engage on all fronts and behind enemy lines, both of which the Genestealer Cults can still do very well indeed. Far better than most armies with their ability to come in from reserve pretty close to enemy lines. Overall, it should mean that the disciples of the Four-Armed Emperor will lose a bit of army power, turning a few close games from wins into losses maybe. Quite a big deal if the opponent's army might not be destroyed by them outright, and it's going to be a game that's going to be quite tight on points themselves. I feel like they're going to be a bit more in line with the other top factions rather than being a bit ahead, and they're still going to be an army that scores well and has the Genestealer Cult player tending to control the game rather than the other way around. I guess perhaps with a little bit less emphasis on just needing raw numbers to outnumber the foe. Neophyte blobs might be a bit less popular. There might be a bit more emphasis on things like the pure strain Genestealers and the Acolytes once more. Neophytes are certainly still good though. I'm sure they won't be going anywhere en masse. I still suspect that they'll be one of the game's top factions, but not just quite so far out in the lead anymore. Next up, we've got the Iron Hands, by far the strongest of the core Codex Space Marine chapters right now. A win rate with around about 56 to 57% typically, generally building around just enormous amounts of heavy weapon damage with things like Eradicators, Devastators, and all manner of vehicles. I think they've come through the changes much better than the Dark Angels, as they didn't have a specific chapter nerf, just the change to the Codex Warfare secondary, which will tone it down. Previously, again, that one could be pretty much auto-include against any army with a good bunch of units on the table. Killing units with heavy weapons in the Devastator doctrine just to get 2 victory points each was really easy. Now I'd say that secondary probably isn't worth taking, even if you are playing Iron Hands. I guess maybe could be a little bit more relevant to the armies that are going to cycle through the doctrines, and overall I suppose it might flip a few close games from wins to losses. Overall though, I really don't think that this is going to significantly impact their win rates or their army power. They'll still fight just as hard as they were before, and were maybe an army that often would win the game just through sheer damage inflicted and tabling the opponent, as opposed to doing clever sneaking outscoring things like the Genestealer Cult. Overall, I still expect them to be pretty top tier. They'll absolutely obliterate a whole bunch of armies that don't like the heavy AP shooting. Moving on to the weaker armies that I think were barely touched, here we have the Thousand Sons, and it looks like technically Games Workshop did try to give them a bit of a help out, but I really don't think that their tweak to the Abhor the Witch secondary is really going to help out the Thousand Sons in any meaningful way. Thousand Sons are the other army that they specifically called out in their balanced Dataslate preview videos, saying that they would probably give them a boost along with Deathwatch. They've got a win rate of about 53%, so maybe a little bit lower than Games Workshop's usual targets. They lost out a bit from the Hour of Contempt changes, and I kind of feel like the best thing for them might have been just a tiny points decrease on things like Rubrics or Scarabs to make amends for that. The way that GW tried to help them out was changing Abhor the Witch. They've done this by moving the class of it, going from a Warpcraft secondary to a Purge the Enemy secondary. The idea being now that it's going to be competing with other secondaries that you might want to take, potentially Assassination, theoretically Bring It Down, though I think Bring It Down isn't exactly going to be taken against Thousand Sons very much. They don't tend to run with a whole bunch of vehicles or monsters. And perhaps most importantly, any good Codex-specific Purge the Enemy type secondaries. For armies that have a really good one of those, it might actually lead to a genuine choice between Abhor the Witch and that, potentially gaining the Thousand Sons a few victory points in some close matchups. I do think in reality though, this really isn't going to help out the Thousand Sons that much. It might gain them a few more victory points in a few very specific matchups. You can't even take Abhor the Witch if the enemy has Psykers, so nothing where you're fighting an enemy Psyker is going to count for this. It won't help them out against most demon armies, for example, or any Space Marine army with a Librarian. And even then I don't think it's going to have too much impact against a bunch of armies that don't have Psykers, as the only generic secondary it's really competing with is Assassination, and I feel like that one's just quite a high risk one to take. Thousand Sons armies might often run with something like 4 characters, so you might be able to get a decent amount of score from it, but I feel like Assassination is always really quite a risky pick unless the enemy's got crazy amounts of characters, particularly for Thousand Sons. You're kind of gambling on breaching their Terminator and Rubric battle lines, and then running around and actually hunting down their Psykers. If the opponent knows that you're going to get victory points from them, they're going to play at least a little bit cagey. And I feel like unless you're looking like you're going to be tabling the Thousand Sons, you might not pick up all that many points from Assassination. As a result, I feel like just the majority of armies that wanted to will still take the Abhor the Witch, and they won't really lose out too much as a result. Overall, I'd say it might help out in a few matchups, but Thousand Suns still look like they're going to be on the lower end of the pecking order and could have used something a bit more meaningful than this, I suspect. Perhaps buffing their own secondaries might have been a bit more reliable to actually help them out, or some sort of actual boost to their power. Otherwise, for minor losers by omission, I guess it's everything else that's on the very borderline low section of Games Workshop's balance area. Certainly I feel armies like, say, AdMech and Chaos Space Marines, maybe Death Guard as well, they've generally been hovering around the 44-45% win rate bracket for a while, perhaps on the borderline as to whether or not Games Workshop might help them out. And besides Deathwatch, Thousand Suns and certain Space Marine chapters, they've got some of the lowest win rates and performance in the game. I'd say that if Games Workshop was going a little bit more completist with their balance pass, they'd probably have given these some small tweaks, maybe slight buff to their secondaries, or maybe some nice rules tweaks to lesser played units perhaps. Perhaps something like giving AdMech Castellan robots a bit of a lift might have been nice. I know they weren't really adjusting points in this update, but maybe reversing the Chaos Terminator points nerfs might have been fair enough. I feel like they'd already had their Death Star significantly hampered by the loss of Armor of Contempt. Going up to 36 points per model just seemed a bit weird on top of that. Again, I'd rank these as minor losers by omission. Didn't get anything to hurt them, but perhaps could have used something to give them a lift. Lastly, for minor losers in the data slate, I'd probably rank the rest of the other non-divergent Space Marine chapters here. The Tactical Doctrine chapters plus White Scars, all of which besides Salamanders were kind of on the lower end of the Space Marine power section. I'd say the Tactical Doctrine chapters were hurt by the Codex Warfare change somewhat. At least they could have been scoring it pretty heftily from turn 2 onwards against armies with loads of units, though in reality I still think it wasn't super strong. Now, as with Iron Hands, I think it's far more questionable, and they're mainly not going to take it whatsoever. I think you could argue, similar to Imperial Fists, that Ultramarines, White Scars and Raven Guard were all struggling a bit, around about a 40% win rate give or take. Salamander's doing significantly better and a bit more mid-tier, but I'd still say that they're minor losers due to the Codex Warfare nerf. Overall though, I wouldn't really expect these guys' win rates to significantly change with that. I feel like it was maybe a little bit niche for the Tactical Doctrine chapters. Moving on into the armies that I'd rate as neither winners nor losers from this. These are the armies that are just about within Games Workshop's target bracket at around 45 to 55% wins, and I don't think had really any major impactful changes from the updates. Custodians are an army that maybe could have been ranked in the minor losers section, I think. They've broadly been doing rather well, with a win rate around about 53%, and are currently the most common competitive played army in Warhammer 40k, so are certainly doing something right. The only change that they got from the balanced data slate was a small nerf to combining two of their strats. You can't have transhuman physiology and the Emperor's Auspex stratagem that turns off rerolls. They can't be applied to the same unit in the same phase, so it's maybe just preventing a big durability spike to throw loads of command points into one unit to make it just ridiculously hard to kill for one turn. Overall, this certainly would be a nerf to perhaps bigger blocks of infantry that you're going with absolutely maximal CP investment in. In reality, though, you couldn't afford to spend these stratagems too many times like that. In reality, I think Adeptus Custodes are going to be absolutely fine. Both of these durability buffs are absolutely fine. I don't think you'd usually necessarily need to combine both of them on one unit. Just pick the one that is going to be most impactful for the type of firepower that you're receiving. I wouldn't expect it to impact their army performance in any major way, so I've chosen to put them in the neither winners nor losers section, even if technically they have been very slightly nerfed. Otherwise, for minor changes that I don't think are really going to be changing that much, I feel like for the Assault Doctrine chapters like Blood Angels, Space Wolves and Black Templars, they're all just about within the middle bracket here. Codex Warfare was kind of bad for them already, but arguably I don't think it's really got any worse for them. They are actually going to be cycling through the doctrines most likely, going from Devastator to Tactical to Assault, so in a pinch you could still potentially use it and try and pick up some points along the way to Assault. Still though, I think it's probably going to be a rare pick. For Grey Knights, kind of similar to the Thousand Suns, their Abhor the Witch change will help them out a very tiny bit, though only in very specific matchups and by a few victory points I suspect. It's just not enough of a general change here to actually impact them, but at least they were doing a touch better than Thousand Suns in the win rates right now. They perhaps weren't so obviously in need of major help, even if they aren't one of the strongest factions in 40k. Finally, for the armies here, there's a whole bunch of them that didn't really get any significant changes this time. I guess if they're towards the lower end of the middle tier, it's not so great for them. If they're towards the upper end, then it's good that they got away with things. Perhaps out of this selection, the Death Guard might have been the army that most needed help. and perhaps armies like Orcs and Leagues of Votan and Craft Worlds tended to be on the stronger side of the middle bracket. So I guess you could argue that they might be slight winners just by omission. Games Workshop hasn't done anything to tone them down from being high middle tier. Finally, we get onto the armies that I think have done best from the balanced data slate. These guys I'd rate winners for various different reasons. A couple of weak armies that actually got a fairly reasonable power boost, Deathwatch and Tyranids. A couple of middling armies that got a small boost with the returning of core to a unit, that's Tau and Drukhari. And then a trio of armies that have been performing rather well in terms of win percentage and tournament results, World Eaters Inari and Chaos Demons, definitely were pushing it towards the upper end of what Games Workshop might consider rebalancing, but didn't get touched at all. After this update, I don't think I'd really rate any single army as being a major winner. Even the Deathwatch and Tyranid changes I don't think are enormous and are going to redefine their fortunes, but should give them a nice boost towards the mid-tier. Going through each of these in turn, first up we have the Deathwatch. In terms of major factions in Warhammer 40k, they are pretty much about as weak as it goes, a 38% win percentage, and just came out of the changes to Space Marines kind of badly. Doctrines that worked worse than most of the rest of the Space Marine chapters now, and things like war gear on their veteran units made them a bit less appealing than maybe some of the other generic Space Marine ones. First up, I think it was a very good idea to give them a change to their combat doctrines. They can now just select the one that they want each and every turn, and I feel that this one's pretty reasonable for the Deathwatch, as their thing was having more flexible doctrines, and they don't get any unique super doctrine that most of the other Space Marine chapters get. I think it will genuinely be quite a nice power boost to the faction just to be able to jump to the doctrine that's going to be most impactful on that turn. If you're just about to line up for a whole bunch of charges, go into the Assault doctrine, or if the game's winding down and you just desperately need to shoot down an enemy unit across the map, then maybe changing back to Devastator or Tactical late game could be fun. I feel like this is going to be impactful, but maybe only up to a point. It's not really an advantage over the other Space Marine chapters if you want to use a lot of Devastator doctrine. All of those guys can use it all game long if they want to as well. And it's maybe only going to be a particularly helpful power boost to the last few turns of the game, as they've already got very good flexibility for the first few turns of the game already, jumping between the doctrines that they can pick from. Still though, quite a nice change, will definitely help them out a fair bit later game if they want to repeat a doctrine multiple times. Otherwise, the boost that they had was to their secondary called Cull Order. This one was the one where you had to pick several different battlefield roles that are in the enemy's army, and then try and wipe out all their units within those roles. The main mission is still the same, you get 5 victory points for each battlefield role that you clear. They've now just added just a bit so it's not all or nothing. If you kill one unit of that role but you don't wipe out the entire role, you get a halfway bonus of 3 victory points. I feel like if you pick that for some battlefield roles that are kind of numerous, your opponent might be hard pressed to prevent you scoring at least fairly high on that. I don't think it's going to be auto-include, and it might require some careful assessment of the enemy army whether you're picking this over something else, but it's definitely a lot more tempting than before. I guess they might be the chapter that's also least affected by the Codex Warfare nerf as well, being able to jump around doctrines as needed for that if they'd like to pick that one. Overall, I'd say that there's 2 small boosts to the army. I'd say it's enough to gain a bit of ground on the rest of the armies in 40k, but still probably one of the weaker factions in the game. I feel like overall they maybe just needed a bit more of a raw strength buff. I would have quite liked it if they'd maybe socked up some rules out of their Kill Team Strike Force formation. Could have been fun to allow them to pick their own chapter tactics for a turn or two. Perhaps a nice way to add in a bit of real army power with rules that already existed until recently. I'd be kind of surprised if these changes get them into the 45 to 55% target that Games Workshop has, though at least going in that general direction it will be a small boost to them. Next up, perhaps one of the other factions that gained the most rules-wise are the Tyranids. The changes to them weren't absolutely huge again, but the reversal of a couple of nerfs that they had before now have been taken off the top spot and are down to around about 45% wins, rather than being one of the strongest factions in the game for most of last year. First up, they removed the balance updates to Hive Tyrants, a couple of restrictions that meant that they always had to be warlords if they were present, and then if the warlord was ever slain, he lost access to the Synaptic Imperatives army-wide, which was quite devastating for the rest of the army. Hive Tyrants are still fairly heavily played, both the Flyrants and the Walking variety, and these two remove a couple of small negatives to taking them. The potential weakness that if the opponent breaks through your Tyrant Guard screens and they go down, then it impacts the rest of the army pretty nastily. And also you could just afford to be a fair bit less cagey with them, perhaps using the big movement and melee of a flying Hive Tyrant to just jump in and destroy something really important, if it does actually make sense to just get that kill and sacrifice the unit. Probably it won't make too much difference in literally every game that's played, but for the ones where a Tyrant is killed early, it'll be quite helpful. The other nerf that was removed was the nerf to the adaptive part of the higher fleets, the ability to select a trait to counter your opponent's list, and you take it from 3 different tables, either feed, lurk, and hunt. Which ones that you have access to varies as per the higher fleets, but in general the lurk ones have a few pretty nasty counters to enemy armies in them. If the enemy has absolutely tons of AP -1, then you can just ignore it for one of the traits. If there's loads of cover about, and the enemy is very shooting focused, you can get a +1 to your saving cover. That could be pretty good for dense cover maybe in particular. And then you could weigh those up against things like territorial instincts for obsec monsters, or just the standard second part that your high fleet comes with. The +1 to charge from hunt is pretty nice if you can get that. Again, this one might not come into play in literally every game. Leviathan still might want to just take its single reroll against a whole bunch of armies, but if one of these traits makes a whole bunch of sense in one given matchup, then it can be quite powerful to apply a better rule across your whole army all at once. Overall, I'd rate this as an okay power boost to Tyranids. Again, I wouldn't expect it to be propelling them to be one of the stronger armies in 40k or anything. Maybe just inching them a bit more out of the bottom tier of armies and going towards the mid tier. Might be good to lift them a few points of win percentage perhaps. Then for other small winners we've got the Tau and the Drukhari, both of which are kind of mid-tier factions, the Tau Empire faring a bit better than the Drukhari right now, and they both had a similar sort of change, regaining core on a unit that lost it, and a fairly meaningful unit at that. For the Tau Empire, they got core back on broadside battlesuits. These things were nerfed as part of the general big nerf to Tau after their codex dropped, and Games Workshop did double nerf these at the time, also giving them a points increase as well. As a result, broadsides became a kind of rarely taken choice within the Tau army, usually outcompeted by units like Hammerheads and Riptides if you just wanted non-core firepower, though I feel that with this keyword added back in, they're genuinely going to be taken quite a bit once more. Perhaps a big unit with a bit of support, and I feel like they will certainly compete very well against the other ones mentioned. Perhaps some of the biggest gains from this are getting a 5+ Feel No Pain from an Ethereal's Invocation. That's quite nice for a dedicated damage and shooting unit. They can get reroll 1s to hit really cheaply just from a nearby commander hanging out with them. And there's a few good buffing Tau Commander Warlord traits, such as auto wounds with hits on 6s, rarely a bad thing to have on a gunline unit. Given that the high yield missile pods still cost more, I'd be expecting the rail rifle to be the go-to main gun, and then I feel like both the smart missiles and the plasma rifles can be kind of useful as the secondary weapon. Depends on whether you want to pay the premium for a bit of ignored line of sight, or have a bit more direct anti-tank fire. Drukhari have been perhaps struggling a little bit more than Tau, maybe towards the bottom of the middle bracket, and their change was to get core back on their pain engines, Talos and Kronos. Kind of similar to broadsides, these are kind of rarely taken since it was initially removed, but given that when it was removed a whole bunch of Drukhari lists were running these guys en masse, I feel like the return to core might mean that we see a whole load more of them. The single biggest thing that it gets them is the ability to get the +1 toughness aura from a homunculus, quite meaningful going up from toughness 6 to 7 against a whole bunch of mid-strength weapons. It also could allow them some rerolls like the Archon ones from the Real Space Raid, which is generally fairly popular given the detachment changes, or perhaps the homunculus warlord trait calculating gaze. I feel like it probably would give the army a small lift, having these be a lot more useful again. I feel like the change will be enough to put them back into Drukhari lists fairly regularly, though admittedly since the nerf happened a whole load of other strong codexes come out, I don't think it's going to be propelling them to be a top tier army or anything like that. Finally, for other effective winners of the data slate, I'd say that it would be these strong armies that basically were on the borderline of whether Games Workshop needed to address them, but they weren't toned down in any way. In one of their preview videos they did say that there'd be a good chance that they might make some minor adjustments to some other strong armies in the game if they did tone down the best stuff, but it does seem that armies like World Eaters, Chaos Demons and Inari, all with win rates are around about 55% or so, all of these seem to have got away with it this time. I'd say no changes is pretty good news for them when the weaker armies weren't buffed by enormous amounts, and a few of the stronger armies like Dark Angels, Iron Hands, Genestealer Cult and Guard, they all got toned down at least a little bit. I feel like they wouldn't have needed anything major to these guys. For competitive play, maybe just toning down secondaries would have been a reasonable way to go. I'd say out of these, Inari are perhaps the most questionable as to whether or not they actually needed addressing. Perhaps a bit more of an oddball Eldar sub-faction that not many people tended to play. For the World Eaters, they just bring a whole load of raw scary melee power, often with Lord Invocatus rushing the enemy with 8-bound, and Angron's maybe a tiny bit less regularly seen competitively, though still has been doing well enough with lists with him in. As for ways that they maybe could have toned them down if they wanted to, Perhaps nerfing that Pile the Skull secondary a little bit might be not the worst. It's a very, very reliable secondary and almost always scores decent amounts, though you do have to sacrifice Blood Tithe points to do so. For Chaos Demons, they're just generally strong all round, often headed up by big demons like the Lord of Change, Be'lakor and a Bloodthirster, backed up by a decent amount of demon troops and maybe some Fleshhounds. A bit of a tricky proposition for a fair few armies. Their demonic reserves type rules are very powerful, and demonic imball saves are very nasty against things that rely on good AP. Finally, Inari are pretty much the top performing Space Elves currently, a very small player base, and I'd say similar to Genestealer Cults and other Eldar armies, they can be a bit punishing if you do play things wrong. Low toughness units can mean that they just get killed very quickly if you aren't careful with them. I'd guess if they ever did do a focus nerf to tone down Inari in their current form, maybe a good target could be just putting a few points on the Incarn. Nothing excessive, maybe something like 10 to 20 points or so. It does seem to be the most auto-include unit that they have. Obviously that's not going to happen before 10th now, so it looks like they're going to be rounding out 9th edition as the strong way to play Eldar. Overall, as mentioned, I'd say that the vast majority of these changes are more sort of nudges than massive shifts in how armies are going to be played, barring maybe the Dark Angel's Deathwing. After the updates, I'd expect to see a fair bit more balance at both ends of the 40k power spectrum. For the stronger armies in the game, I'd still expect Iron Hands, Dark Angels and Genestealer Cults all to be up there. I don't think any of them got hit hard enough to really change that, except that Dark Angels list will be a lot more pivoted towards Ravenwing. I feel like they're all going to be a lot more on the same level of armies like Chaos Demons, World Eaters and Inari though, so maybe a bit more contention for the top spots. As for weaker armies, I feel like Deathwatch would have closed the gap on the other ones that are a touch weaker than most. They might well still be the weakest faction in 40k despite the changes. Otherwise, the ones on the lower end of the win percentage spectrum will be things like Thousand Suns, Chaos Marines, Admech, Death Guard, Blood Angels and the weaker Space Marine chapters, and these changes haven't really changed that. Perhaps Tyranids might be just about jumping out of this group, though if so, then not by very much. Let me know your thoughts though, I'll be interested to hear what you think about your faction's changes to the balanced data slate, and whether they've had a major or minor blow, or more or less the same. Following this up, I'll probably try and make one last 40k tier list for 9th edition 40k, maybe after we've seen a little bit more as to how the changes impact how people are playing these forces. If you'd like to see that or other Warhammer 40k updates, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you've been enjoying all the updates on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics has a Patreon page as well, and that's how I can afford to keep the updates coming quite so regularly. If you are enjoying quite a bit, any support is enormously appreciated over there. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.